morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 27th, 2022. And if you're anything like me, you've probably heard plenty about the freedom of speech and freedom of the press lately. And I personally think most people, even when they get a lot of it right, they get some major parts of it wrong. So on this episode, I'm actually doing a follow-up. So this is like volume 2 of another episode I did a couple of years ago. But I want to highlight some views on both the freedom of speech and freedom of the press from 5 leading founders. This time I've got Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, well, Benjamin Franklin, of course, a few times, then Samuel Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. I'm mostly going to use their words rather than trying to wax eloquent on what their views were. But I also want to highlight one of the primary essays from the early 18th century that actually influenced their views. First of all, before getting to that, I really want to say thank you. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Hi to Tim Martin in South Central Arizona, Dixie Strong representing Alabama, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri. Tim Martin says, Siebes, for some time now, the free press is nothing more than government's propaganda branch. Yes, and I would say that if the press is really just acting as a mouthpiece for government, it really isn't free, but we do have some other options probably. But I don't want to get too much editorializing on my end. But good point, Tim. Sherry Voluntary, my good friend over on Facebook. Good to see you, Sherry. Tyler B. Haji in Southeast Michigan. Jennifer Coop. Sharon, Cowboy Roy Rogers, Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, and everyone else. I appreciate you being here, but let's get right to this, and I want to start out with Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, who on March 14th, 1768, over in the Boston Gazette, writing as populace, wrote this: "There is nothing so terrible to tyrants and their tools and abettors as a free press." So the freedom of speech, the ability to speak is one thing. The ability to publish and share is even more powerful because it gets your thoughts out to so many other people. Now, he wasn't the first, obviously, to have this type of a view, and these were very closely tied together. Let's go back to Benjamin Franklin. We often see him as kind of like, well, they call him the first American, but also the first really leading spokesman for the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And here he is, just 16 years old at the time, July 9th, 1722. He said this in writing as Silence Dogood in the New England Courant. He said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech, a thing terrible to public traitors." So very similar to what Samuel Adams said. The freedom of the press, freedom of speech is a terrible tool to tyrants, to public traitors. Same thing. 16 years old at the time. The interesting thing, though, he didn't actually write he published it. But here's some interesting history from Robert Shibley over at FIRE. He says, this particular statement of free speech was not actually written by Franklin, but rather quoted at length with approval from Franklin from an abstract from the London Journal. Why at 16 years old is he quoting and publishing in a paper? Now, this is how Robert put it. He says it gets weirder. The issue of the Courant. So he had been trying to publish in the Courant for a while. It was run by his brother, and the brother just kept saying, no, I'm not going to run your stuff. But his brother ends up going to jail. This issue of the Courant from July 2nd through 9th, 1722, was printed by Benjamin Franklin. He was the printer of record at the time, not James Franklin. Why? Because James was in jail at the time for printing something that offended government officials in Massachusetts, for publishing, for printing, for sharing unorthodox views, maybe unwanted views, and he went to prison at the time. So young Benjamin Franklin, 16 years old, comes in and talks about how freedom of speech, freedom of the press is a terrible thing to public traitors. And so Robert goes on, he says the 16-year-old Benjamin Franklin went on publishing the paper without him. Now, while we could go much further back in history to talk about the foundational principles behind these essential natural rights, I'd say that the person most influential on the founders and the old revolutionaries in these thoughts, and I think you'll see some very close things, almost exact, was Thomas Gordon, writing in Cato's Letters, a series that were published in the 1720s. This is number 15. I will link to it in the show notes for this episode. Cato's Letter, number 15, published February 4th, 1721. And the title is Of Freedom of Speech, that the same is inseparable from public liberty. And he starts out with, without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. It's so essential. This is like the foundation, the bedrock. This sacred privilege, he said, is so essential to free government that the security of property and the freedom of speech always go together. We don't always think of freedom of speech as kind of a property right as well. James Madison talked about this in the 1790s, talking about how freedom of thought, freedom in your mind, you own your own thoughts, you own your own body, so therefore you can think and utter and do those things which that an owner would be able to do. He said, in those wretched countries, now not Madison, this is back to Thomas Gordon Cato's letter, number 15, in those wretched countries where a man cannot call his tongue his own, he can scarce call anything else his own. You can't own your own speech. There is no property rights. And this is where we're going to see something very familiar is next, what young Benjamin Franklin really published the following year. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of the nation must begin by subduing the freedom of speech, a thing terrible to public traitors. So it's almost the exact same quote, but that's basically what Benjamin Franklin was quoting the following year at 16 years old. So he was a vociferous, he was widely read, he was hungry for information. We know Abigail Adams, some years later, writing to her son, she pointed out that learning isn't attained by chance, it must be sought after with diligence and vigor. Anyways, here's Cato's letter again. Freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together, and it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them. So that is really some foundational stuff. There's a lot more on it. Please do, when you have some time, read through that whole paper because you'll see a lot of the same things that many of the founders and old revolutionaries had to say, and I think they were really just drawing on Thomas Gordon's Cato's letters, and we could probably say Gordon was drawing on some previous work as well. Now here's Benjamin Franklin again. On freedom of speech and the press, November 17, 1737. And this is just a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. When freedom of speech is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved, and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Again, the same type of message. When freedom of speech, if you want to take over a country, you have to first start by not taking it away, but by subduing it. All you have to do is start subduing the freeness of speech, and that's the first step towards conquering a people. But when freedom of speech is finally taken away, then freedom is totally dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Next up is James Madison, but first I should mention that if you want to read these things, I keep saying, oh, you should check this out, read this paper, etc. If you want to read these, I will link to all of them in the show notes. I publish a blog post for each individual episode about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is over, and you'll find those over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There, not only are you going to find the links that I'm mentioning in the show notes for this particular episode, but you'll also find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Twitch, DLive. We also live stream at Odyssey.com, which is decentralized and censorship resistant. We upload the archive version of the video over at, well, it's the same video, but I'm just recording while I'm streaming live. We archive over at Gab and Minds and MeWe and Brighteon and BitChute and Hyper and Rumble and basically everywhere possible that we can share this type of information. And if you want short versions, we've been doing about 5 times a week, Mike Meharry and myself, and we're reaching a lot of new people over on TikTok and Instagram Reels. We're doing 1-minute quick takes on essential foundational principles for the Constitution and liberty as well. Anyways, so you'll find all this stuff, even our membership program, all the platforms over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path path to liberty. Anyways, enough with the marketing part there. I do want to make sure you guys can find all this information as well, because I'm citing all these source documents, and it really is essential to get a grasp of what's going on, not just to read a single quote, but to actually encourage, just like Abigail Adams said, learning more, attend to it with vigor, and look to read and learn more in context on our own time. Now, here's James Madison writing in the Report of 1800, January 7th, 1800. And the timing and what this is also very important. In the Report of 1800, he's explaining what the Virginia legislature did in 1798 in calling for interposition. The states, they said, written by James Madison, approved by the Virginia legislature, are duty-bound to interpose against the federal government to arrest the progress of the evil that the federal government is doing when it does it. So today, constantly, duty-bound, not just a good idea. And what were they duty-bound to oppose? It was the Alien and Sedition Act signed by John Adams in 1798. The Sedition Act criminalized much free speech. You couldn't actually bring any member of the federal government, other than the vice president specifically, who was the opposing party's Thomas Jefferson. You couldn't bring the federal government into ill repute. So this was an attack on this natural right of free speech and the freedom of the press. You couldn't publish it. They did arrest people. They arrested someone from the House of Representatives, Griswold in Connecticut, who actually won re-election from jail. So this was a serious attack on the freedom of speech. And James Madison is explaining what the state of Virginia passed opposing that. And he's talking about how, well, I understand how some people want to control speech, but here, check this out. Some degree of abuse is inseparable from the proper use of everything. And in no instance is this more true than in that of the press. Think about that. Every time someone wants to attack any particular right, all they do is they just highlight over and over and over and over again how someone used that right to harm others. Whether it's the right to self-defense, right to keep and bear arms. If someone does something wrong, then everyone has to lose their rights. This is a Marxist collectivist, and I'm not the type of person that calls everything I disagree with communist, but it certainly is a collective punishment. And collective punishment is one of the most evil things on earth. If someone does something bad, that person is responsible for what they did bad, not everyone else on earth. So Madison is pointing out, I'm losing my framing here. Madison is pointing out that with all liberty, someone is going to abuse it. There's always going to be someone doing something wrong. But you don't punish all of society for it. And he said in no instance is this more true than the press. He even recognized back in 1800, the press caused a lot of problems. But, he said, it has accordingly been decided by the practice of the states that it is better to leave a few of its noxious branches to their luxuriant growth than by pruning them away to injure the vigor of those yielding the proper fruits. So you don't attack everything good to stop the tiny bit that is doing the bad, even if it seems to be overwhelming today. And a lot of people take the opposite approach today, and I think Madison's view on this is incredibly important. Thomas Jefferson had a similar view, and of course, he worked with Madison to draft those resolutions, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, responding to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Jefferson was swept into office. Well, not really swept. It was very close. He barely got in. But his first inaugural the following year, in March of 1801, he even touches on this as well. And he says, and mind you, this would not be a conversation most people would be having today. He said he wins, and so he's pointing out, like, okay, maybe you guys want to leave the Union because I'm in office. We hear all the time, if so-and-so wins, I'm going to Canada. If so-and-so takes over this business, I'm going to here, whatever. At the time, some people were seriously suggesting, well, maybe we need to leave the Union if this guy wins. So he said, if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this Union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. That, to me, unpacking that doesn't take very long. But to me, Thomas Jefferson is saying the antidote to speech that you disagree with is not to restrict the speech, but more speech to counter it. The antidote to speech you disagree with is not restricting it, but having more of it to counter it. Let me read it again. Let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which the error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. There's not a lot of reason around us these days, but I don't want to get too deep into that. Anyways, here's George Washington in his Newburgh Address, March 15th, 1783. He said, "For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind," and you'll recognize this part, "reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." That's George Washington in his Newburgh Address, March 15th, 1783. Now, I've got so many from Benjamin Franklin, but we'll just do 3 on this one today. And here he's taking a very similar approach. Like, look, you can't, well, we'll just let Benjamin Franklin's words. The title of what he was publishing is called Apology for Printers, recognizing that some people didn't like what people were printing and publishing. But you can't just publish what everyone likes. Because why? He said, if all printers were determined not to print anything till they were sure it would offend nobody, there would be very little printed. Again, if all printers were determined not to print anything till they were sure it would offend nobody, there would be very little printed. I only saw in the background someone was saying, oh, wow, Benjamin Franklin really called the last few years. And this is in 1731, and he was recognizing that if people just held back because they were concerned about how they were going to offend people's feelings, which is what we're having constantly today, all the time. No one wants, it's always like not even cover my ears. I mean, it would be so much better if people didn't like something, if they just ran away, used mute buttons, block, all that stuff. There's so many tools for people to do this. There's so much information. But no, people have an authoritarian instinct. Like, it's almost mind-blowing how bad it is, because anytime someone doesn't like something, they want to control and stop people. It's always about control and total destruction of other people's ability to do whatever that you don't like. Well, not you, of course. So Benjamin Franklin in 1731, Apology for Printers. Of course, I will link to all these in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I thought, this is not from a founder, and this is not one of the 5, but I thought this was really interesting. As I was reading through some of this, it's been a long time since I read the 19th century's Democracy in America. I think this is from volume 1 in 1835. Let me see. Tocqueville's Democracy in America, 1835. Listen to this. This sounds very familiar as well. He wrote, "In America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe to him if he goes beyond them." And that should sound familiar to all of us today. Oh, yeah, you hear people saying, oh, okay, I don't have any problems with online moderation. I don't have any problems with government guidance on this or that, because what they're saying is within the bounds of what's acceptable opinion. But as soon as you go beyond that, woe to him if he goes beyond them. And that's what Tocqueville recognized in 1835. I'm not sure if that's an American problem, if that's a global problem, if that's a human problem, or what that is, but that certainly people really, really can't stand opinions that rattle their cages. And sometimes some of the opinions are absolute garbage. I use a lot of these alternative social platforms to share information for 10th Amendment Center. I don't really have too many personal accounts out there, but I do share as much as possible in as many places as possible. And on some of them, most of the content, when I've looked through the feed, is just repulsive garbage. I don't want to read it, but I'm not trying to shut people up. I think, like Thomas Jefferson said, the antidote to bad speech is more. So what I try to do is focus on the message that I find to be positive and share it as widely as possible. Oh, I should also mention, I mentioned right at the beginning that this is kind of a volume 2 of a series on founders on the freedom of speech. I'm repeating some of the same messages, but I did an episode back in 2020, May of 2020, 5 founders on the freedom of speech. I will link to that in the show notes as well over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to take a quick look over in the live chat and see if there's any questions or comments I can respond to or just share with you guys as well. A couple people talking about the Ron Paul Liberty Report. And interestingly enough, for those of you guys who've been around since the beginning of the show, when I first started, it was just going to be a live stream broadcast. And my intention was actually to follow up on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. So if people are sticking around, they're like they just were watching something, they might have something else that's interesting talking about the Constitution and liberty to follow up. Sherry says, I think it's a global problem, but it's a lot more noticeable in the West because we still have some ability to speak freely and incite the ninnies. Oh, that's interesting. So it's probably the same elsewhere, but because it's so restricted, you don't notice how everyone's trying to shut everybody up because they're already kind of shut up by government. That's an interesting point. Haji says Ron Paul Liberty Report and Path to Liberty are an excellent 1-2 punch for freedom. That was my intention. I don't get a chance. It's interesting. I don't actually get a chance to watch Ron and Daniel McAdams very often because I'm getting set up to do the show. So a lot of times I'll watch that on the archives or listen to it a little bit later. Cowboy Roy Rogers says when peaceable debate does not work, it becomes time for less speech and more positive action. I think always more speech to explain what you're doing and why. Even when the founding generation were after Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775, they had a couple of months of fighting. Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson drafted the Declaration of, this is why we're fighting. The Declaration of, oh man, I can't even think of it. Brain fart on that one. But Second Continental Congress passed this July 6, 1775. One of you probably know this in the chat. But basically they were explaining, why are we doing this? We're fighting they have attacked us. And as soon as they back down from this claimed power over us in all cases whatsoever, then we can be peaceful friends, just as we always have been. So you always explain what your actions are. You want to rally other people to the cause, explain to the world what's going on as well. Someone with the screen name Samuel Adams, which is just awesome, points out one of my favorite Adams quotes: all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. That was in 1771, again in the Boston Gazette, which was the mouthpiece, the publication organ of the Sons of Liberty. Cowboy Roy Rogers says thank you as well. So Sharon also agrees with, over on YouTube, agrees with Sherry. Very similar names. You guys are awesome. Thinks it's a global problem on this nature of people wanting to shut people up when they go outside of normal opinion. And if Tocqueville was noticing this in 1835, I think this is something that maybe we haven't paid attention to enough. At least I haven't. It's a global problem. Look what happens to people who dare speak out. Yeah, whatever it may be, people get attacked. Going a little bit further, let's see if there's any other questions. Eric Nance, I wonder what would have been said about a printing press manufacturer that retained the power to review and approve anything that was to be printed. Well, so there is some that we can look at that on that as well, Eric. And I think it's an interesting question because there is a property right in being able to publish. And a lot of things didn't get published, but Benjamin Franklin in 1731 is pointing out it's actually good business to publish all kinds of stuff. It's good business to publish things that you don't agree with. And in the ratification debates, some on the Federalist side try to use what we could call cancel culture today. They didn't want to get the opposing view of the Pennsylvania minority published. They didn't want to get the anti-Federalist view out there, so they actually threatened printers. Anyone who decided that they wanted to print the anti-Federalist case, the opposition to ratification, they were threatened with losing subscription. So people were canceling subscriptions, trying to shut them down, sometimes even some mob violence to go after them. And then even the Federalists who were using that tactic at that time, they recognized very shortly after, like, if we really want to win this ratification debate, we've had a lot of bad feedback on this and we need to stop. It's actually a bad strategy because it coalesces the opposition against you. So I think there is a property right issue there where people can make those choices, but I think it's a bad choice. Again, it's better to be more open to more opinions than not. Now, of course, not everyone's going to want to do that, but hopefully that's an interesting thing to think about as well. But I appreciate you bringing that up, Eric. That's really good stuff. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. Please don't forget to support us. There's a number of ways you can do it. For free, of course, you can smash the like button. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Leave comments in the archives. All that stuff will trigger the algorithm and tell them to show us to more people. And don't forget our membership program. You can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you being here. And I'll see you next time on the path to liberty.